It began on a seemingly ordinary evening. We had just finished dinner, and the usual discussion of household matters gave way to something sharper. More charged, she looked at me angrily as I asked her about a bill that needed to be paid, a routine question. Her response was anything but routine. With a tone that cut through the air, she said, "I am not your property." Her words hung in the room like a storm cloud. At first, I didn't know how to react. Was it an accusation, a statement of defiance, a declaration of independence? The way she said it, her tone, the look in her eyes felt like she was drawing a line in the sand, challenging the very foundation of what I believed our relationship was built on. I didn't say anything. What could I say? I just nodded. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something colder, something resolute. Her words echoed in my head as I cleared the table in silence. I thought about how much I had sacrificed. I thought about how much I had sacrificed over the years, working long hours, dealing with problems, constantly making sure everything in her life ran smoothly. And now I was hearing that none of it mattered because to her, I had apparently treated her like property. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation. Was she right? Had I been controlling? Had I reduced her role in our relationship to something transactional? Or was this her way of shirking the responsibilities we both agreed to when we got married? It was impossible to tell what she really meant, but one thing was clear. She didn't see herself as accountable to me. As I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, a quiet resolve grew in me. Fine, I thought, if she didn't want to be my property, I wouldn't treat her as such. But that also meant she couldn't expect me to shoulder the burden of being responsible for her. It wasn't about revenge. The next morning she acted as if nothing had happened, but I was already different. The mental change I had made was absolute. I decided to keep my actions subtle, at least at first. No big announcements, no confrontations. Instead, I would let the situation speak for itself. I let the situation speak for itself. When she asked if I would pay a bill that week, I told her calmly, "You can handle it." She gave me a confused look but didn't say much. It was a small thing, but to me it was symbolic. I wasn't going to be her caretaker anymore. I wasn't going to manage her life while she dismissed my role as something oppressive or insulting. As the day went on, I noticed other opportunities to let her take the reins. When the faucet in the kitchen started leaking, I didn't grab my toolbox. When her car needed gas, I didn't take her to the gas station like I usually did. Each time she seemed confused, maybe even angry. I wasn't angry, I was focused. This wasn't about punishment. It was about balance. If she didn't want to be treated like she belonged to me, then she couldn't expect the privileges. I wouldn't interfere in her life, but I wouldn't prop it up either. At the end of the day, I could feel a slight tension in the air. She knew something was wrong, but she hadn't connected the dots yet, and I wasn't going to explain it to her if she wanted independence. That night, as I lay in bed again, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't a game or a passing phase. This was a shift in how I saw our relationship and how I would handle it in the future. Whatever came next, I was ready to show her exactly what life without it looked like. The next morning, I woke up early as usual, but this time I didn't feel the familiar sense of obligation pulling me out of bed. I stayed there for a few extra minutes, listening to the sounds of her morning routine starting down the hall. I stayed put and let her take care of it, I thought, when I finally got up to find her in the kitchen, standing by the coffee maker with a cup in her hand, the car keys beside her, and I could tell she was expecting me to mention her oil change, something she had been reminding me about all week, but I didn't. I poured myself some coffee and sat down, scrolling through my phone like it was just another day. "You're bringing the car in today, right?" she asked after a few minutes of silence. I didn't look up. "No. You can handle it." She froze her mug halfway to her lips. "What do you mean? You always take care of that?" I shrugged. "Not this time, it's your car." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. She left the house with a quick clip goodbye, and I could hear the faint slam of the car door as she drove off. That was the first small crack in the routine, but it didn't end there. The whole day I went about my business. With a deliberate detachment, she called me during her lunch break to remind me about an insurance payment, something I had always done without fail. "Hey, don't forget the car insurance is due tomorrow," she said casually. I didn't hesitate. "You can pay it. The account details are in the folder." There was a pause, just long enough for me to sense the confusion. Long enough for me to sense the confusion on the other end. "Why are you acting like this?" she finally asked. I kept my tone calm. "I'm not acting like anything. I'm just letting you do things you're perfectly capable of doing." The line went silent again before she let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Okay, fine, whatever." When she came home that night, the tension was palpable. I had deliberately left some things undone, like not taking out the garbage, something I usually did without fail. I could see her look at the overflowing garbage can as she walked into the kitchen. She didn't say anything, but her frustration was written all over her face. Her face dinner was another quiet affair. She was waiting for me to say something to explain myself, but I didn't. I cooked for myself, left the dishes in the sink, and went back to my own tasks without offering to do anything for her. It wasn't spite. It was a quiet demonstration of what life was like without the responsibilities she had come to expect of me. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she asked. Her voice sharp. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her. "You said you're not my property, right?" Her expression hardened. "Yes, I said that." "Well," I replied evenly, "if you're not my property, then you're not my property. If you are not my property, then you are not my responsibility either." Her mouth opened, as if she was about to argue, but no words came out. She stood there for a moment staring at me before turning and walking out of the room. I heard the bedroom door close with a sharp click. As I sat there in the silence, I felt a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't the first time I'd seen her like this. It wasn't easy. There was no satisfaction in watching her struggle with the shift in our dynamic. But I knew it was necessary. If she wanted independence, I was determined to give it to her, even if it meant dismantling the foundation we had built together one small piece at a time. The next few days were a quiet unraveling. I stuck to my plan, maintaining my calm exterior while stepping away from tasks and responsibilities I once took on without a second thought. The cracks in our routine grew wider. With each passing day, the first significant break came one evening when she returned from work. The house was darker than usual, and the garbage was still by the door where I had left it. Normally, I would have already taken it out, turned on the lights, and started dinner, but instead I was sitting in the living room watching a show, completely uninterrupted. "Just sitting there?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. I didn't even look up. "Yep. Long day." She dropped her bag on the counter with more force than any needed. "You could at least take out the trash." I shrugged. "It's not that heavy. You can manage." Her eyes widened slightly as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. For a moment it looked like she was going to argue, but instead she grabbed the garbage bag and stormed out the door, slamming it behind her. The next morning I woke up to find the sink piled high with dishes. It was the first time I'd seen her leave them unwashed. A small act of defiance. She wasn't going to let me win. The dominoes continued to fall. Food ran low because I didn't restock the pantry. Her laundry sat untouched in the basket, even though I'd always done it without asking. Small inconveniences began to pile up, and her frustration grew. By midweek, the tension had reached a boiling point. She came home from work to find that I hadn't paid the electric bill. I knew that because the lights had been turned off earlier in the afternoon. I could have paid it in a few minutes, but I didn't. I wanted her to feel the consequences directly this time. She stormed into the living room, her face flushed with anger. "The power is off," she shouted. "Why didn't you pay the bill?" I met her eyes calmly. "You knew it was due. The account details are in the folder." She threw her hands up in despair. "Why are you doing this? You are being so childish." I stood up slowly, letting her words hang in the air. "Childish? You said you're not my property. Remember? I respect that. But if you're not my property, then I'm not your caretaker. You want independence? Fine. But independence means taking responsibility for your life." Her expression faltered for a moment, as if she wasn't sure what to say. Then she said, "I'm not your caretaker." I didn't argue. I just let the words hang in the air as I walked past her into the kitchen. I wasn't interested in convincing her. I wanted her to understand. That night, she ended up on the phone with customer service trying to sort out the power problem. I could hear the frustration in her voice as she navigated the automated system. Something I would have handled with ease before watching her struggle. It wasn't satisfying, but it reinforced my decision that if she wanted me to step back, I would do so completely, even if it made life harder for both of us. By the end of the week, the house felt different, not just because of the piles of clutter or the unfinished business, but because of the silence, the unspoken tension between us. Slipped into a kind of cold war, each testing the other's limits. The one seamless rhythm of our relationship had become disjointed. A series of beats and awkward silences, and yet I remained steadfast. If this was the path she wanted, I would follow it to its conclusion, no matter where it'll be. By the end of the week, the tension in the house was suffocating. The power had been restored, the garbage had finally been taken out, and some of the groceries had been restocked. She did the bare minimum to keep things running, but the weight of our unraveling routine was in her every move. The silence between us had become a battleground, each of us waiting for the other to speak first. That Saturday morning, I sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and scrolling through my phone. I didn't look up. What can't? She spun around to face me. This whatever this is, you're acting like a passive observer in this house. We're supposed to be a team. I put my phone down and leaned back in my chair. Are we? Because the last time I checked you said you weren't my property? Teams are built on responsibility, and I don't think I'm a part of yours anymore. She crossed her arms, her jaw clenching. Don't twist my words. I didn't mean I want you out of our lives completely. Well, that's the thing about words, I replied, my tone calm but firm. Once they're out there, they mean something. You've made it clear you don't want to feel like you owe me anything. Fine. But that goes both ways. Her frustration boiled over. This isn't about owing anyone anything. It's about respect. About not feeling like my life revolves around your decisions. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. Respect, I said, my voice finally rising. Do you think respect is me silently fixing every problem, paying every bill, and cleaning up every mess without so much as a thank you? Do you think respect is telling me that all that effort makes you feel like property? You feel like property because if that's what you think, then you don't know the first thing about respect. She flinched, her arms dropping to her sides for a moment, the fight draining out of her. But then she straightened, her voice softer, but no less firm. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you to do everything. No, I said, step closer, but you expected it. Every time I stepped in to make things easier, you let me. Every time I picked up the slack, you let me go. And when I tried to talk about how it felt to carry all that, you dismissed it as control. Her eyes glazed over and she looked away, her hands clenching into fists. So what now? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. Are we just going to keep tearing each other apart? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back to the table, picked up my coffee cup, and stared into it. I don't know, I finally admitted, but I know. I finally admitted it, but I know I'm tired of being the only one carrying the weight. If that's what you wanted, true independence, then you've got it, but don't expect me to pick up the pieces when things fall apart. She stood there for a long moment, as if waiting for me to take back my words. When I didn't, she let out a shaky breath and walked out of the room. I heard the bedroom door close quietly, this time far away from the slamming doors of the past few days. I stayed in the kitchen for a while, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The house felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that settles in after a storm for the first time. I wasn't sure if there was anything left to salvage, or if either of us even wanted to try. Every interaction felt calculated, every word measured. It was clear that neither of us knew how to bridge the gap, or if we even wanted to. The first ripple of consequences came when her friend Emily called. Usually Emily would call her directly, but this time she reached out to me. I hesitated. She's fine, I replied, just busy. Emily sounded skeptical. She missed lunch with us on Saturday. That's not like her. I didn't know what to say, so I deflected. Maybe you should ask her about it. That seemed to be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, my mother called. Apparently my wife had confided in her in a moment of frustration. My mother's tone was stern, the way it had been when I was a teenager in trouble. What's going on between you two? She demanded. She said, you refuse to help with anything that doesn't sound like you. I sighed and pinched the bridge of my nose. It's complicated. Well, maybe you should uncomplicate it. She snapped. Marriage isn't about keeping score, it's about partnership. Her words stung, but I didn't argue. There was no point in explaining the nuances. There was no point in explaining the nuances to someone who didn't live in our house, who didn't feel the weight of unspoken expectations and resentments that had built up over the years. The fallout wasn't just personal, though the tension began to creep into other areas of our lives. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying conversations in my head, wondering where it all went wrong. Overheard her on a Zoom call with her boss, apologizing for missing a deadline that wasn't like her. She was always the one who had it together, who stayed on top of things, but lately the cracks in her professional demeanor were starting to show. One night I came home to find her sitting on the couch with her laptop open, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when she heard me come in, her eyes tired and red. Wi-Fi isn't working. Fi isn't working, she said flatly. I called the provider, but they said the account was passed due. I stood there for a moment, torn between stepping in and letting her handle it. Finally I said, you know how to pay it, right? She didn't respond. Instead she closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, her words taking me by surprise. What do you mean? I feel like I'm drowning and you're just standing there watching. I wanted to argue, to remind her that this was the independence she asked for, but looking at her at that moment, I couldn't. She didn't look defiant or strong. She looked exhausted, and then it hit me. The consequences of our standoff weren't just affecting her. They were affecting both of us. The house was a mess, the bills were piling up, and we were both too stubborn to admit that this wasn't working. Whatever point I was trying to make was starting to lose its meaning in the face of what we were actually losing. Each other. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy for the first time in weeks. It didn't feel like a fight. It felt like a stalemate, like we'd both run out of moves. I didn't want it to come to this. I finally said. She looked at me. Her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Sadness maybe, or regret. Neither could I. We sat there for a long time, saying nothing, both of us trying to figure out what came next in the aftermath of everything we had let fall apart. We didn't fix things that night. There was no magical reconciliation, no heartfelt apologies or promises of change instead. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken truce. It wasn't an agreement. It was exhaustion. We had reached the limit of what either of us could take. The first change came in small, hesitant steps. The next morning, I woke up to find her at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, bills, receipts, and bank statements. She looked up as I entered the room, and for a moment we just stared at each other. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. I sat down and we began to sort through the mess we'd both been ignoring for too long. She had questions about payments and due dates, and I answered without judgment or sarcasm for the first time in weeks. That small act of cooperation set the tone for the days that followed. She began to take more initiative, calling the utility companies, making appointments, even cooking dinner without waiting for me to step in. It wasn't a return to the way things had been, but it was a start. The conversation came slowly. At first one night as we sat on the couch watching TV, she muted the show and turned to me. "Do you really think I don't appreciate you?" she asked. I looked at her, surprised at the sudden question. "Sometimes it felt like you didn't." I admitted that everything I did was just expected. "Never noticed." She nodded her head. Her expression was thoughtful. "I didn't mean for it to feel that way. I guess I got so used to you handling everything that I forgot what it must have been like for you. And I forgot to tell you when I needed help," I said instead of saying something. I just let it build until it turned into resentment. That honesty was a turning point. We started having more of those conversations, real ones, where we said what we felt without fear of starting another fight. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension, but the effort was worth it. It was no longer about one of us taking care of the other. It was about sharing the burden. She learned to lean on me without becoming dependent, and I learned to step back without feeling like I was letting her down. Things weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. The clutter in our house was slowly disappearing. But the scars of those weeks remained, serving as reminders of how close we had come to losing each other. One night, as we sat down to dinner, she reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "I don't want to go back to the way things were," she said, "but I don't want to lose this either." I nodded and squeezed her hand gently. I didn't either, and just like that we found our new normal, not as property or responsibility, but as partners learning to navigate the messiness of life together.